Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Moss coming to you with a bit of a new RCQ season review. So, just in case you weren't already aware, the fourth RCQ season, the one in the United States that qualifies for Atlanta later this year, just began last weekend, and Team Primetime, in its first event, all of us that played managed to top 8. And the promos for this one, the Unholy Heat and the Eldritch Evolution are kind of sick. And it wasn't just our RCQ that happened this weekend. RCQs across the country popped off, and the Mana Trader Series event actually happened as well. So we're going to take a little bit of time, go through some of these events, look at the early March of the Machine metagame, and see what types of decks are starting to emerge in this new RCQ season. Maybe some potential tech, some potential decks that could wind up being really good if you're trying to spike your events this season. And we're going to go ahead and start off with the big one, the Mana Trader Series event that occurred Saturday and Sunday. Now, unsurprisingly, the decks that we saw standing out here, pretty easy to call from a mile away. The winner, Rakdos Midrange. And this Rakdos version, 25 lands, you've got the 4 man lands, you got the Urborg. It's about as traditional of a Rakdos list that you can get nowadays, with maybe the weird exception of the split of Kroxa between the main and the side. Rakdos has been a staple of this format since its beginning, and it's only gotten better with the inclusion of Shieldred, to a certain extent Misery Shadow, and a handful of other good cards. The deck has game against everything. There's really not a whole lot to say here, or at least not a whole lot that hasn't already been said by a bunch of different pros, and eventually, later on this season, you're going to see our own team members posting their preferred deck list for the season, some sideboard guides, and some matchup guides for each of them. So be sure to be on the lookout on our Twitter and Instagram accounts for that. But Rakdos, my deck of choice. This deck and the one that I took to my local RCQ on Saturday, pretty similar, besides a few cards in the sideboard and me trying to see what a couple of the new cards felt like. Easy enough to see, and obviously if Rakdos is going to be at the top, Lotus Field is going to be right there behind it. Again, it's all the same stuff that we're used to seeing out of this deck. Mono green, the Spirits deck. Again, one of the things that we're seeing more this season, and we definitely saw it a lot at the end of the last one, is if you're looking for a good aggro deck, and especially a tribal aggro deck, Spirits is the way to go. Throughout Pioneer's existence, this Spirits deck has taken on different iterations, be it the Bant Coco version, the Mono Blue version that dominated for quite some time because it was lean, low to the ground. But I think that this blue-white version with Empyrean Eagle, with Spell Queller, that this is the version that we really want to be on the lookout for. And with cards like Catilda in its sideboard, with that little bit about protection from vampires, helping a lot in the Rakdos matchup, and then just being able to get all sorts of crazy things like Skyclave Apparition, Wedding Announcement, Settle the Wreckage, and Portable Hole. All of these cards make the Spirits deck a go-to aggro deck in this format if you're not trying to do the traditional green-red vehicles, mono-red type of package. You got mono-green for the combo deck, Arc Light Phoenix, which will always continue to put up results, and The interesting one that made its way to the top 8 here, Mono Black Control. This is a deck that I also saw in the RCQ that I played locally. It leaned a little bit more heavily on a devotion theme than with this control-oriented build. But there's something here. Any deck that can play main board Invoke Despair and Shieldred, both the new one and the older one, is a really good deck. If you're looking for something that isn't traditional control, which has definitely been on a decline in the face of Rakdos aggro, this might be the deck for you. Lots of value that can be generated with Invoke Despair. You've got cards like Castle Lochthwain that help you out, and Sign in Blood for sneaky kills with Shieldred. The deck's really good, and it's definitely worth considering. The Mana Traders event really just highlighted everything that's been going on in Pioneer. We're not really seeing too much that's new out of many of the top performing decks. Again, Lotus Field wasn't really trying anything new. You've got Mono Green, which some versions are starting to adopt Pelucranos as a really interesting inclusion. I think that it's actually pretty sweet, but there's a lot that can be seen and a lot that can be left to desired if you can't flip this card, but getting all that mana super easy out of this deck. Alright, in some smaller RCQs that we've seen around the world and in the preliminary events as well, we've seen a lot more of the same. Rakdos midrange, Gruul aggro, which, for those of you that aren't familiar with all the different variations of Gruul that there are, there's traditional Gruul aggro. We've got Atarka red here, and then you've got Gruul Vehicles, which Gruul Vehicles is a great deck into a Rakdos midrange heavy room, but it struggles in a lot of other areas. This Atarka red deck, powerful out of the gate, but definitely struggles into a mid and late game. So the mileage varies with a lot of these, but if you're trying to get some quick wins and trying to take advantage of slower decks, this is the one to do it. Auras will continue to be a staple as long as we continue to see more and more interesting auras printed. We've got, obviously, Kaya's Ghost Form, Light Paws. Skrelv is an interesting, newer inclusion. And as is Saiba Cryptomancer. Alright, a good backup hexproof card, really strong in this deck. Now, if this is the version that will stick around, that's to be discovered. But for now, a really good start for this, and one of the decks that's been showing up a lot on Magic Online, and is starting to see more and more play in paper, is Dimir Rogues. Now, Rogues, as an archetype, picked up a lot of interesting cards, things like Fairy Mastermind, the one that helps you draw more cards whenever your opponent draws their second one, and it's got some card drawing text right here with, obviously, the relevant card type. And the Battle of Invasion of Amonkhet. Mill 3, make your opponent discard, you draw, and when it flips, it turns into a 4/4 copy of anything in the graveyard. What doesn't sound better than a 3-mana Shieldred? Card's sick, and I think it's something that a lot more decks should be picking up. Aspiring Spike has definitely been playing it in Modern, so it's certainly worth looking at in other formats. Again, both of the preliminaries that were last weekend and earlier this week, we see lots of our traditional things. Mono green, a blue-white control deck that showed up, really good, but again, nothing too crazy. We're seeing like 1 and 2 ofs with some of the newer cards, things like Change the Equation, White Weenie, obviously picking up Invasion of Gobakon, and starting to come back to Brave the Elements. Some decks were moving away from it at the end of the last season, and with the uptick in mono green, if you're going to end up playing this particular aggro deck, you shouldn't leave home without at least a copy or 2 in your main board, for sure. But looking at some of the RCQs, we've got this one in Italy that, unfortunately, we only have top 4 data for off of MTG top 8. But out of that top 4, 2 black-red mid-range lists, and then black-red sack, and then blue-red creativity, which surprisingly doesn't show up a lot on the MTGO side of things. Creativity is a list that sees a lot of play in paper because of its easy and really good wins, but not so much online. And that's a very curious circumstance that definitely needs some more examination. But it keeps putting up results in paper. And while it doesn't have that much of a presence in the recent big events online, if you've got it, if you're a modern player that plays creativity, the deck ports over really well to Pioneer, and you're definitely going to pick up some big wins with it. And one that's a little bit closer to home, we see this RCQ at Gamers Paradise in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Again, we see 3 Rakdos decks that made their way into the top 8 here at a 65-player tournament. Now again, really good. Greasefang, Blue-White Control, 4-color Omnath, technically 5 because of that little tricky booger Valky, and the Spirit aggro deck. All of these things are what we are really coming to expect out of the Pioneer metagame. It's clearly becoming a lot more standardized, and even with this first week of play, we're seeing some small inclusions of new cards. Even the Bring to Light Omnath decks are starting to play things like Borborygmos and Fibblethip, or any number of other cards. Rakdos, some versions are trying out a couple of different things. The new Sheoldred, or in the version that I played, Pylon. And thinking about some of the decks that Team Primetime took to events, let's go ahead and take a look at what we brought to the top tables. Now, I'll admit, my weekend was really good. Played hot, double drew into the top 8 with Rakdos midrange. Now, couple of things that my version of the deck is doing differently. Obviously, 2 copies of Croaks in the main. You will, however, note 3 copies of Graveyard Trespasser and 0 copies of Misery Shadow. In our area, the upstate of South Carolina, we don't really have that many mono green players. And if you're picking up the deck, and Rakdos is definitely a deck that rewards those who know what they're potentially going to be playing against. If you're going into an open room, playing a fairly standard list is definitely going to help you. So those Misery Shadows will definitely need to be sleeved up and in your deck. But if you know what's going to be in that room, or if you can anticipate it, then make the calls. In a green light meta, Misery Shadow's not necessarily needed. more graveyard hate, singular target graveyard hate, is really going to be good. Obviously, Fatal Push, Thoughtseize. I'm running 2 Abrade in my main board because we do have a lot of Greasefang players in the area. And again, more reason for the Graveyard Trespasser too in this circumstance. Go for the Throat was an interesting call given the Greasefang meta. There's an Angels player in our area, so Power Word Kill, definitely not good. Some of the creativity players in our area running Atraxa. I did expect the Atraxa Reanimator deck to be there, or the Neo form version. And again, Power Word Kill, kind of useless there. So Go for the Throat, huge, and Pile On. Had to try out the new cards, see what they were doing, and Surveil 2, a chef's kiss because it feeds Croxa. And Croxa's a hungry lad, so you gotta keep him fed. Now, because I am in a Greasefang dense meta, you'll note that I don't have the actual copy of Takenuma here. I did run Takenuma in lieu of running a 4th swamp. I was expecting a lot more mono red than there actually was in the room, so I made that call last minute, threw the Takenuma in, ran the 3 swamps. If you're expecting a lot of mono red, go heavier on your basic lands because they are definitely not leaving home without Furnace Punisher. And then sideboard, Duress, Rending Volley, Noxious Grasp, all the obvious things. The biggest thing to remember, if you're a Rakdos player, Leyline of the Void is tempting for Greasefang. It is tempting for Mono Green. However, those decks run Beseiju. You're liable to just cycle away your extra copies of Leyline with your blood tokens. You're likely going to discard it with Liliana of the Veil. Go Blank is infinitely better. Discard and exile. Huge. It stops all the big value decks, it stops Reanimator decks dead in their tracks, and stops them from potentially drawing into really hot cards. This card alone won me my match against Mono Black Control. And ripping 2 back-to-back and having Necromentia to take all of the Invoke Despairs they had, huge. Now, the other important inclusion here. This is a thing of the past. If you've been playing Pioneer since the format's beginning, if you've been playing Pioneer since Rakdos and Mono Green took off as the top decks in the format, then you're familiar with this card. Life Bane Zombie is a house. If you have a Niv to light or Omnath to light heavy meta, if you have a Neo brand heavy meta, if you have a Mono Green heavy meta, 2 or 3 potential copies of this need to be in your sideboard. I called an audible with 1, knowing that there were about 3 Greasefang players in that room, and 2 Mono Green players. And this card won me a game against Mono Green. And understand, this card puts in work. Exiling green or white creature cards, huge. The rest of the sideboard, pretty standard. Sorin is actually an inclusion to kind of help against those Omnath to light decks and helps you a little bit against control as well. Them not really being able to deal with the ult is important. And obviously, Invoke Despair, the mid-range Mirror Breaker, when Fable isn't the mirror breaker that you need it to be. Unfortunately, though, while I made it to top 8, I lost in the quarterfinals to our team captain, who is our resident 80 card Yorion player. Now, this mad lad runs the 80 card Niv Mizzet Reborn Bring to Light deck. As you can see here, his deck is very similar to the Omnath to Light ones. Obviously, it's going to be heavier on the land count. And because it's a little bit heavier on the land count, and because it's the bigger deck, it runs a lot of interesting cards. The thing that won our match that I couldn't deal with was the Scarab God. If you're going to be playing the Omnath to Light deck, the Scarab God is actually a really reasonable inclusion if you're expecting a very creature-dense room. Being able to steal all of your opponent's threats and then just absolutely devastate them with their own things while draining them each upkeep, huge. And then, obviously, it doesn't die. It keeps coming back. No matter how many times you kill it, it keeps coming back. It needs an exile spell. And if there's one thing that Rakdos decks like mine lack, it's good exile-based removal. Don't let it hit the battlefield, or it's tearing you apart. And if it does, then it will take over a game. Now, his sideboard, Hidetsugu Consumes All, you got Reckner Bankbuster, Vanishing Verse, Mystical Disputes, Dovin's Vetoes, Clarion, Pithing Needle, Slaughter Games in the side. That's what his sideboard does that a lot of the traditional 60-card Omnath to Light decks do, or rather, do in the main. This deck being so big has so many answers to different things with Bring to Light, it makes sense why Slaughter Games is in the side, but those nut draws from decks like Greasefang can definitely have this deck reeling. So, an important consideration if you're going to play this or other versions, and if you want to see a masterclass in just how this deck performs, watch Leonard play it on our channel. But Leonard was even beaten in the semifinals by our other teammate who ran the Reed Duke Special. Congrats to Nolan for making it to the finals with Is It Creativity. Now, for everyone that watched the Pro Tour, they definitely knew how this went for good old Reed Duke. He won, and he won on the back of the Creativity combo. X equals 2, World Spine Worm, and Xenagos off the top. Or, if you're playing sideboard matches, Hullbreaker Horror, or, as some decks have also started to do recently, Atraxa. A really good inclusion. Now, what Nolan ended up doing was basically what we see here. The only difference is, where Reed Duke had Fire Prophecy, Nolan ran the new spell that replaces this in March of the Machine. The one that targets battles, but still does all the same stuff. Planeswalkers, battles, creatures, 3 damage to them. Put a card from your hand into the bottom. So if you do the wrong thing of drawing that World Spine Worm, tuck it, and then boom. You can creativity freely after that. Unfortunately, while Nolan made it to the finals, he did not get the win. He was taken down by a Gruul aggro deck. Not a Tarka Red. Not vehicles. But Gruul aggro. This is an interesting deck. For those of you that have been playing Pioneer for a while, a long, long time ago, Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, made a good budget mono green deck. And the Gruul deck that we saw winning our RCQ, our one slot RCQ, mind you, basically did that. It did a good combination of Seth's budget mono green deck with some of the red creatures and spells that we're familiar with from regular modern Gruul aggro lists. So Bone Crusher Giant, the Reckless Storm Seeker combination of cards, but no Atarka's Command, no vehicles, just good creature beats. And that player was on a tear all weekend. He was Leonard's only loss that entire day. So again, the aggro deck beating out the massive combo deck, a huge consideration. But I think if you're going to be playing in RCQs this Pioneer season, or rather, this season with Pioneer, there's really not a bad deck for you to take. Honestly, Pioneer is in a very similar place to where Modern was several years ago. Any deck, as we have seen across all of this past week's events, can definitely take you to where you need to go. All you have to do is just put in the time, know the format, and your deck will reward you with all the wins that you can imagine. While I might be partial to Rakdos, while Nolan might be partial to Creativity, while Leonard may be partial to Nivtalite, the deck that you pick can be the deck that you win with. Y'all got this. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. And hopefully, we see you guys playing in Atlanta. Peace.